to our podcast. I'm Jonna Monaghan. I'm Director of Women's Platform. This is the second episode of our podcast series, which is all about trying to demystify human rights and look at how they can be relevant in our everyday lives. And today we will focus on human rights and violence against women and girls. And our guests today are Karen Devlin and Sonia McMullen from Women's Aid Federation Northern Ireland.
Hello.
It goes without saying that there is not many clearer breaches of human rights than violence against women and girls. And there are standards and principles in place we can use. But what does that look like, and how do we help women know what their rights are? So the key question really for today is violence against women and girls is very clearly a human rights violation. And can you share your thoughts on how we can relate violence against women and girls to human rights in all its different forms?
Okay, well, I'll start, shall I, Karen? So I suppose in relation to human rights and all of the vast amount of things you've just noted there, Jonna, I think it's really important that it underpins all of the strategies in relation to domestic and sexual abuse, for example, that we have here. So the domestic and sexual abuse strategy has recently been launched, the new one, as has the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which is the first of its kind. We were the only part of the UK and Ireland that didn't have such a strategy. But all of these strategies that are there to support anyone affected by both domestic and sexual abuse as a victim and a survivor, you know, all of the human rights and rights-based approaches should underpin each and every one of those strategies, each and every one of those action plans that goes out. And there should be a monitoring and an oversight for that as well. I think something that is a real challenge for us at the moment in relation to the EU and our sitting outside of it is the EU directive on ending violence against women and girls. And because we're sitting in the UK, we sit outside of that. So I think we really should be fighting for a similar model, you know, to underpin all of that and bring us in line, because at the moment we don't have that same approach, and it is really unfortunate that we're sitting outside of the EU for that. I suppose in relation to Istanbul as well, you know, we have ratified it, but there's still some things missing with regard to immigration, for example. And I think that's a big key issue here in the north, especially with no recourse to public funds. We have more and more women coming through as victims of human trafficking, domestic servitude, and they're not being dealt with appropriately. The domestic abuse bill that went through Westminster, for example, incorporated immigration and had more rights around that. So that's something that's missing as well. But I will hand over to you, Karen, if you want to add anything to that.
I think the most important thing is, for me, is always about like how this affects people on the ground, how it affects support services, how it affects women who want to come forward and need help, and how our statutory agencies engage with them. Because when you talk about, if I stopped a random person on the street and started talking about the Istanbul Convention, they would probably have no idea what I'm talking about. And that's the reality of really breaking down and, you know, having discussions like this, breaking down these big international frameworks and relating them to people on the street, people in your community, your town, your city. And I think it's about demystifying it, because for me, international frameworks are the receipts as such of what we can do to hold decision makers to account of what they're not doing enough of, or praising if they're doing something well in regards to these international standards that we all agree are the basis that help protect victims and survivors of gender-based violence. So for me, it's about really demystifying that and bringing it to account that it's about having the receipts as such when going to government and saying you haven't done this thing that you signed up for, and it's because of that you're failing women and girls and protecting their human rights.
Thank you so much for that. And I actually have a question that just about how we can look at the demystification. But I'm just interested, Sonia, in what you said about the EU directive. And I was wondering what would be helpful for us to have from that. And I was wondering as well, because about women who from migrant, asylum seeker, refugee backgrounds, they can be particularly vulnerable to violence because of their specific identities. And some obviously arrive here fleeing violence. And we have those derogations from the Istanbul Convention that haven't been put in place in the UK. What do you think needs to change there to make an impact on those?
I think it's really challenging at the moment when we look at the launch of the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. There's 3 million attached to that for over 2 years, very little amount of money coming through and commitment from government. Although we welcome the strategy, of course we do, and all the work that's gone on through the Executive Office, we are challenged because of the lack of resources that we have. If you look at the work that is done locally through our Women's Aid local groups with women who are arriving here, either trafficked, they've no recourse to public funds, or maybe on spousal visas, all of those kind of issues, there simply isn't enough funding going through there in relation to the support that is required. And there is a lot more support required with regard to the one-on-one support, the interpreter services that we need, just the level of training and cultural awareness that we all need as supporters and advocates that we need as well. We are a country that nobody really wanted to live in for 30, 40 years, and now we have a lot of newcomers coming in, and it's wonderful to see the diversity. But we all need that cultural awareness as well for women coming into our services, that we can appropriately support them better. But that needs to be resourced. Look at everything that has happened over the last, number of months with regard to hate crime and everything too, and all of this horrible stuff that everybody has had to cope with. So there needs to be investment, and we're back again to that money piece and specialised services for women who are experiencing all forms of domestic and sexual abuse as well. Many of these women have had horrific journeys coming from other parts of the world, and journeys that have taken months to arrive, and then to experience more abuse, maybe in the hotels they're living in and the inappropriate accommodation they're living in as well. So I think there needs to be ownership of that by, the powers that be and the Assembly. But the recognition of that too, I think too many things in the North go back to that green and orange instead of dealing with the key issues. But certainly in relation to immigration, a lot of the work we have done, for example, in Women's Aid, we've had to fund ourselves. We're working with charities, we're working with churches, trying to top up and help those women with no recourse to public funds. And that shouldn't be the way either. We should be able to support those women.
I think as well, just even going back to things like, the amount of countries who've signed up for the Istanbul Convention as an example, it's about making sure, if you've travelled from one country to another that has the convention in place, you should feel like you should have the same access to support if you're a victim of gender-based violence, whether it be trafficking, whether it be domestic abuse. The support has to be there. If we truly want to tackle gender-based violence as a human rights issue, there has to be firm commitment. And I'm not just talking about words, I'm talking about deeds as well. I'm talking about resourcing. As Sonia said, even cultural awareness, as we have lovely emerging communities here in Northern Ireland, and it's great to see, all the different people, all different cultures, and it's about making sure that we have the resources in place to help support them, whether it be, for example, if unfortunately if a woman's been seriously sexually assaulted, that she has to speak through an interpreter, understanding cultural sensitivities of perhaps she would like a female interpreter rather than a male interpreter, just in regards to explaining what happened, things like that, small things that really, really would be a benefit to victims, survivors of sexual trauma, for example, and just making sure that we have that dignity and respect, because that's what human rights should be doing. It should be bringing dignity and respect to everyone. And for women and girls, it's about understanding their needs and acting appropriately, not just deeds, but words.
That's a lovely way of describing
I did steal it
human
off
rights.
suffragettes, to be fair. But yes.
And again, I think the critical thing is the political will, and a lot of it is about implementing that, because human rights standards really are only as strong as we make them. So you mentioned the new Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy for Northern Ireland. What I thought was really good to see is that it refers to international human rights framework, so the Istanbul Convention, CEDAW as the UN Convention on Women's Rights. What do you think is needed to make sure that those links are actually implemented and mean more than warm words?
I think for us, because we have exited from the EU, it's having those accountable mechanisms, because a lot of them are, I know they're international, but a lot of them are sitting, in that European context as well. And for me, it's oversight, accountability and scrutiny. And we say that about all of the strategies that come out, all of the work that is being done, that we simply don't have that. It would be wonderful to have a body that is scrutinising and overseeing this. Whenever we called for the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy a number of years ago, we've been fighting for that too. Like, why are we the last part of the UK to have such a strategy? What was different here? Crimes that disproportionately affect women and girls affect you anywhere. It doesn't matter where you live. So very frustrating, but a good news day. And we welcome that the strategy was released by the Deputy First Minister and the First Minister, and a great commitment from them. And there has been from the start, as well as our Head of Civil Service, Jane Brady as well, who was in attendance. The Executive Office have produced a really good document, and they have, modelled it on European frameworks, with the pillars, and we welcome that too. It makes sense. But definitely we need an oversight body to be able to make sure that it is connected, it is relating, and it's linking into all of those international frameworks and mechanisms. Because who really is holding them account? We have the Criminal Justice Inspectorate who reviews pieces of legislation and comes back, and we use them as a model to be able to lobby on, things that maybe haven't happened. But there simply isn't. We don't have a domestic abuse commissioner. We don't have that kind of mechanism to hold people to account. And because of everything that's always going on in this part of the world, I don't think our politicians, when you talk about Istanbul or CEDAW or whatever, it's not on their radar. And it's certainly not something that is discussed widely either.
I think that's why it's so important that, unfortunately, campaigners have to really, really hammer it home that the demand for the End of Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, that was a real collective effort where there was this gap in Northern Ireland at that time in 2021 where there was no violence against women and girls strategy, there was no coordinated plan for government, and it was campaigning that led to this point where in 2024 a strategy is in place now. But that's about those who lobby and campaign and support having to do that and push politicians in that direction. And unfortunately, that's what it takes. But it's important that we do that and continue to do that. So, it's important to have the regulation of a governance body, for example, but it's also important that we as service providers, as statutory agencies, all work together to make sure that documents like the End of Violence Against Women and Girls strategy aren't just nice pieces of paper. They actually mean something, and if we actually want to make sure that women in our communities are safe in their own homes, because overwhelmingly women murdered in Northern Ireland are murdered in their own homes. It's a fact. It's a fact that exists across many nations around the world. Unfortunately, the safest place for many women globally is not the home at all.
So the key issue really is around accountability
100%.
And also making sure that they are accountable. I think, Sonia, everything you said was really interesting. Both of you, what you were talking about, the sort of redress. How do you see the role of the judicial system? What about their understanding of the human rights principles that underpin the strategy?
Where do we start on this one now, Una? Oh my goodness. The issue of the judiciary, there is a pillar obviously within both the domestic and sexual abuse strategy and the End in Violence Against Women and Girls strategy in relation to that criminal justice pathway. And of course, the issue of the judiciary is there in relation to training, in relation to rape myths, for example, around our jurors. How do we deal with those? There's so many different issues, but that pathway to justice is really, really difficult and challenging. We talk about a trauma-informed justice system, and we look at the link up between, we've got prisons, we've got probation, court service, public protection service, and then the judiciary. But the judiciary aren't accountable to anybody. We have the Lady Chief Justice, which is wonderful. To have a female in that post, someone who has come from a history of the family courts, for example, who understands domestic abuse and has been very supportive within her role to date, and we welcome that. Many of the judges have had to have training or all, within those courts around domestic abuse, coercive control, the Stalking Act, non-fatal strangulation, all of those things that have come in the last couple of years, which we welcome. But there's so much more learning that is needed across the board. There is so much more that we can do to make the system more trauma-informed, more victim-focused. We have the REC, the Remote Evidence Centre, the new one that is opened in Belfast, which we welcome. And it means that people can go there to give their evidence in a supportive environment. But there was cases in the last few weeks where women were, 7 and 8 years waiting on a case to come to court. Who would stop, and have to stop their life in so many ways to go through that and not be able to get on in that journey to recovery.
I think as well is there's lots of good practices in other countries that we can learn from. I would collate a lot of the femicide statistics, so women who've been murdered in Northern Ireland and women who've been murdered on the island of Ireland. We would hold a record with our sister organisation in the Republic. One thing that struck me, there was a Irish woman who was murdered in Spain. And I was following the case just because of the nature of our work. And it was being tried through a special end of violence against women and girls court. And it was, being sped up in the priority there. And I looked a bit more into it and I was just like, this is really interesting. It's being treated as what it is, unfortunately, femicide, the extreme of gender-based violence. And it was just, there's good practices in other countries that we can learn from. It's about reflecting the seriousness of the crime as well. And I think for a lot of women, for them, it's that recognition of getting into court and a conviction is really important. But it's also about their long-term well-being and how we, if an assault happens today and the case doesn't go to court properly for 3 or 4 years, then how are we treating our women and girls when we say, you just have to hold on there's a delay in the court. It's about being respectful and understanding and being trauma informed. It's so key to really respect the dignity of victims and survivors.
Yeah, we'd so much legislation came through over the last number of years and campaigns and everything, and you're encouraging people to come forward, report this crime, go to the police and have your day in court and everything. But really, that's not the case whenever it comes to it. So few cases actually go through to the courts due to a lack of evidence or whatever it may be. And that's really challenging. A lot of people will withdraw as well due to the delays. And if we look, as Karen has said, at some of the really good models and even other parts of the UK where cases are dealt with very swiftly and quickly, maybe domestic abuse pilot courts. We have a domestic abuse listings court in Foyle. It's not a pilot anymore because it's been going on for years, but it's only in listings that they're all heard, in the same day. But in Belfast at the moment, there is a pilot going through with the Public Prosecution Service in Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid, and they have a criminal justice worker. They meet in their remote evidence centre, and there's a lot more support and provision put in place there in that advocate role. And those cases are going through very successfully. But there's only very small numbers, 4 or 5 cases a quarter. So it's not going to change the world. But we know what we need to do. It's just about putting the money in. That post is being funded from America, from the state office in America.
I think that message has been done really clearly. And I think, we're coming towards the end of this podcast. But just before we finish up, a final question and your reflections on that. How can we help make sure that women and girls actually know what their rights are in this space?
Well, we're talking a lot about prevention before we get to the criminal justice system. And I think prevention is key. So we're back to that old chestnut of RSE and looking at what we can do with young people, having a module within RSE class around rights and frameworks, to better inform what your rights are, I think is key. But just looking at healthy relationships is really important because that empowers our young boys and young girls. It really does, because we need to bring everyone along in this journey with us, and we need to support everybody to make ultimately this society and community a safer place for all. So I think it's back to not just schools but youth clubs and other, sports clubs. We all have a place to play, and all of society is a place to play. Business as well, if we look at the Safe Leave Act coming through too. This is everybody's business. And if everybody did play a small part in it, they could ultimately eradicate all forms of violence against women and girls. We all do have to play our part, but ultimately it's about changing those attitudes and behaviours at a really early age. So it's all about prevention for me, definitely.
I think as well, it's accessibility. And when I say accessibility, I mean when people hear big international conventions and human rights, to think, I need a law degree to understand this. Like, for me, it's really about demystifying and stripping it all back to the bare bones of, you have a right to feel protected and safe, and going from there, and those key concepts. I think when I was just reflecting when you were saying about, school and talking about that, I think the only rights I ever learned about at school was the UN Rights and Convention of the Child. That's the only real human rights we ever talked about. I remember it being accessible and understanding, and I think it's about making sure these things are any kind of document talking about your rights to be protected from violence against you if you're a woman or girl, it has to be simple, has to be concise, but it has to be easily understood. Because if you have just loads of jargon, and so it's about resources online in their language, and being clear and concise is key.
And I think if we had had a Bill of Rights, if we ever get our Bill of Rights, that would have been really good, because it would have been introduced through our schools, you know, as that framework in a way that is child-friendly and age-appropriate. And I think that would be the way forward.
That is a really clear message. Karen and Sonia, thank you so much. And for anyone who's been affected by any of the issues or want to find out more about the work of Women's Aid, your website is
women'saidni.org, and it'll have all the information for women's aid groups throughout Northern Ireland, and we primarily support women, children and young people affected by domestic abuse.
So you can go and find more information there. Our next episode looks at intersectionality, or how people's different and multiple identities come together and how we can integrate human rights into that. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time. Bye.